The other thing that I think is really important that I've come to understand over time is sometimes student questions don't take the form of a question. They won't start with what, where, how, or why. They'll start with a statement that is really kind of a test of like, this is what I believe to be true. What do you think is almost what they're saying. They'll put out something that they're not sure about, and they'll want some clarification on that. And as teachers, we need to really listen for those kind of statements where it's really like a wondering more than a well-articulated question. And we need to kind of be able to recognize that, hear that, and say, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. How would we find out if that was true or not? And then really help our students to frame a question from that. So there's a difference between getting good questions when we invite students to write questions and actually being able to listen for and hear genuine acts of inquiry. And they will come very naturally once students are engaged. You almost don't have to teach them to ask questions. Humans are inquisitive beings just by our very nature. Students will start asking questions when they start wondering. And so it takes some rich opportunities for engagement, some shared learning experiences, and then the questions will start to flow from there.
Welcome to the School Leaders Project, a podcast series dedicated to helping school leaders make positive changes in their schools and communities. In every episode, we talk to extraordinary thinkers and doers about their experiences and experiments with teaching and learning. The School Leaders Project is an initiative by Toddle, your all-in-one teaching and learning platform made for teachers and by teachers. Toddle offers a truly integrated experience, so all of your big picture curriculum planning flows seamlessly into day-to-day instruction, assessment, reporting, and parent communications. Toddle started as a passion project in a school that thought our teaching tech should be as cool as our teaching teams, and we're now loved by more than 1,500 progressive K-12 schools all around the world. In today's episode of our podcast, I welcome Rachel French onto the show. Rachel co-authored arguably my favorite book in education, Concept-Based Inquiry in Action. This episode is jam-packed with questions that I had for Rachel. Questions like, how much should we pre-plan a unit versus being responsive? How do we get kids to ask better questions? What's the difference between a transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and disciplinary unit? And there's just so many practical strategies that you can use that take inquiry from something you're kind of trying to something you feel confident and curious and excited about. I love talking with Rachel, and I hope that you enjoy this episode. Let's jump in. Thanks so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's always an honor.
We were just saying before I pressed record that, Rachel, you're one of my heroes, and your book really unlocked teaching for me and my husband. So I've been kind of fangirling to have you come on.
Thank you. Well, Carla and I really wrote the book as a journey in order to be able to support our own thinking and to be able to support the teachers that we were working with when we were PYP coordinators. And then hopefully people like you around the world in being able to really unpack practical strategies and then understand a framework for why we do what we do and be more intentional about the way that they're teaching.
Rachel and Carla's book there is Concept-Based Inquiry in Action. And if you've not checked it out, I think it's the best book for transforming your practice. So can you set the stage for our audience a little bit and just kind of let us get to know you? Who are you? What's the work that you're most passionate about?
Sure. So I am now living back in New Zealand, but I traveled and worked for really most of my 20s and 30s. I was working in international schools around the world and always in PYP schools. I worked first as a teacher and then as a PYP coordinator. And in that journey, the piece that really I found it a bit of a challenge to understand was the role of concepts. And so at one stage I was moving from the school that I was working at in Egypt as a PYP coordinator to Frankfurt International School. But at Frankfurt, they only had a part-time role available, a 50% PYP coordinator role, which ended up really changing the trajectory of my career, because at the time I was sitting in Egypt before I moved and I was like, well, what am I going to do with the other 50% of my time? And I remember thinking I would love to do what Lynn Erickson does. So I just Googled Lynn Erickson, and lo and behold, on her website, she was offering a trainer certification program. And as part of that trainer certification, it was an opportunity to lead workshops on concept-based curriculum. So I had to send her an email, and she, we corresponded a bit, and I decided to take the leap and to go to Montana and do the trainer certification. And it was at that trainer certification program that I met Carla Marshall. And we really connected that week. There were about 30 or 40 of us at the training program. It was a 7-day program. But it was Carla and I that were going out for dinner every night and kind of sharing stories and, sharing ideas. And so we both completed the week and became certified trainers, and then went back to our schools. She was working in a school, I think I'm just trying to think back, maybe in Switzerland at the time. And then she moved to Asia and then came back to Europe. But each year, Carla and I reconnected at the IB conferences. And, the first year we're just like, oh, hi, nice to see you again. And then the second year we'd really sat down and we're chatting a little bit more. And I think it was the third year that we met at the IB conference in Rome. And I can still remember sitting in this little cafe, and I said to her, I'm starting a video project. I'd been working with Lynn and Lois quite a bit at that time. Every time Lynn or Lois came to Europe, I would see that they were coming and say, hey, can I come along and just help you at the workshop? I kind of almost stalked them and was like, you're coming to Europe. Can I come too? And so I had been working with them and talking about filming examples of classroom practice. So I was telling Carla this, and she said, yeah, I'm thinking about writing a book. So by the time we left the cafe, we had decided to collaborate on that project. And it sort of started from there. And we decided that the easier place to start was to film some examples of classroom practice, and that we could release a video series. And then when we'd done that, we would move on to the possibility of a book. However, when we probably filmed in 4 or 5 different classrooms around the world, and we realized that the videos wouldn't stand alone, and that people wouldn't be able to take enough from that to implement it in a classroom. So we said, okay, I don't think we're going to be able to release the videos until we write the book that goes with them. And so that was how it started, that, we decided to collaborate on this book. There were, I'm trying to think, it was probably about an 18-month process to write the book and film the videos that went with it, because the book has about 20 videos of classroom practice that are linked to the examples in the book. So it was an incredible journey. Both of us were having babies at the time. So when I think back to it, I kind of go, I'm not sure how we got through all of that. So yeah, the book was published just after my second child was born.
So it's wild to see how all the stars aligned there. And one of the things I like to call out is that, like, you pursued the mentorship. That I think a lot of times we think that kind of relationship will fall into our lap. But when you find someone who's worth following and learning from, sometimes you do have to put that work in, and it can be life-changing.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Like I actively still to this day continue to reach out to and connect with people who I think can help me grow as a thought partner. And now I've had the opportunity to lead the trainer certification program since Dr. Erickson and Dr. Lanning have retired. It's now a program that I lead with Tiffany Brown each year. And also that was something that, it's funny because now when I look back, Lynn said that I pursued that and asked her. I don't remember that, but then she came back and said, okay, we're ready to retire. Would you like to go on and lead the trainer certification program? And that really just came about because I had connected with her so many times, and I had presented with her. And each time I presented with her, the first time I just went and helped her and gave support to the small group work. The next time she got me to present a module. I'll never forget that because it was at a workshop in London, and she asked me the night before while we were out for dinner, would you like to present a module? And I was like, of course I would. And then I was like, I haven't looked at those notes for a long time. So, I went back and I emailed my husband, quick, you need to send me the slideshow that's got all of my notes in it. And and I had the opportunity to present a module, and then ultimately we would present half of the workshop each, which was just a phenomenal opportunity.
Cool.
Every time I worked with them, I learned so much more from both Lynn and Lois. I loved, for the first, I think 3 or 4 years that we did the trainer certification, they would come and present pieces of it. And my favorite part of that was just to be able to catch up with them each year, because they're such incredibly knowledgeable and so, warm and friendly and funny, that just being able to, connect with other people that are like-minded, that have the same beliefs about what children are capable of is refreshing. And, it's how we all grow.
Well, and they, like you, are those people who, when they say something, it's like something you can gnaw on and go back to. It's almost like every sentence is a conceptual generalization, and you can come back to it and understand it deeper as your understanding grows, which is so cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was how I got to that point, because I was going every time that Lynn came to Europe. Every time I heard her speak, even though she was giving the same presentation, I learned something.
You changed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we don't do that enough. It's like going back and reading your favorite book over and over again. Typically, in professional learning, we'll go to a workshop once and then it'll be done and that's it. And we don't have the time to really let that resonate and sink in and come back with questions. I remember every single year that we ran the Institute, we would still be, in the kind of week before, we would still be refining things or changing generalizations or debating with each other. No, I don't think that's a very clear example, and this is why, or have you considered this? So, that's how we all grow. There are pieces now of our the book that Carla and I wrote that I would change if we were to publish it again, but that's just part of, our learning journey and part of how we all grow together. So.
Okay, I'm adding that as a question to ask you later about the changes you'd make to the book. But before we get too deep into the weeds, I love it. Your book, for me, was the aha was concepts. And I'd heard about concepts before, and I, theoretically understood their importance, but that book just like turned something on in my brain. So why do you think concepts are so important when we're thinking about inquiry or just learning in general?
Great question. When I first was introduced to concepts, it was the PYP key concepts. And so, I put a lot of emphasis into those key concepts, but didn't really understand why concepts were so important.
Same.
But concepts are really at the heart of building understanding. So we start with specific examples, but it's not until we move to that conceptual level that we can start to see patterns and make connections. And it's working at that more transferable conceptual level that we can build understanding that will support us in a new learning context. Otherwise, we have to learn everything separately. The whole reason that we need to continue to reteach is because students haven't gone beyond knowledge to deeper understanding. So it's building our understanding of concepts and conceptual relationships that facilitate understanding.
Well, and it mirrors how our brain works. Like our neural network is strengthened by connection making. And that's all concepts are really, is just like, I call them hashtags for your mind. It's a way to organize information. Yeah. Right. So do you have a cool example that kind of helps the idea of concepts click with teachers who haven't quite gotten it yet, or maybe just kind of, on that edge?
Yeah. What I think we have to do is really build our understanding of what is and what is not a concept. And the reason I say that is if we're still holding on to a misconception that is concepts must transcend disciplines, that's when we're not really getting to the heart of conceptual teaching. So if we think that it's only a concept, if it is really macro, like our key concepts, like form, function, change, they all transcend disciplines. But in order to really deeply understand concepts, we need to be delving into much more micro concepts. Like a good example of that is understanding the concept of character. But character is something that we study every single year from probably pre-kindergarten right through to grade 12. And if we're just working at the level of character, we're not going to get the depth of understanding or the specificity and complexity that comes with a deep understanding of character. So in order to do that, we need to understand more micro concepts like protagonist and antagonist. And so really drilling down into an understanding of what are the concepts in each of the disciplines that we teach that we want our students to understand. And then what do we want them to understand about that? So when teachers are really struggling to write a conceptual understanding or write their central idea, I just tell them start with one concept and then ask yourself, what is it that I want my students to understand about that concept? What do I want them to understand about a protagonist? What do I want them to understand about multiplication or about congruence or whatever concept you think your students need to be learning at that age? And then the next question I'll usually ask is that new learning? Because quite often we can write really good conceptual understandings, but in actual fact, the students already understand that. And it might sound like a well-crafted conceptual understanding, but it's actually not the new learning that our students need in that year.
Very interesting. Okay, I'm gonna keep drilling on this because to me this is just so important. Can you tell the story about when it resonated with you? Like, what was the situation that happened that you were just like, like it's not just key concepts, the related. Like, what was your kind of love story with concepts?
Well, to be honest, I still remember when the PYP coordinator that I was working with in Brazil introduced Lynn Erickson's work. And to me, it was like, I didn't understand it when she first introduced it, but it was enough for me to go, this is significant. There's something more that I need here in order to really understand why we're doing this. Because at that stage, I was teaching with central ideas, but I was doing what we were all taught to do, write the central idea on the wall, display it, and then it didn't really change my teaching much after that. I was still teaching at a fairly factual level, just with an overarching central idea. And to be honest, it wasn't until I went to the Trainer Certification Institute and immersed myself in that learning for 7 days and wrote, I don't know how many understandings we wrote that week or refined, that I went, wow, this is significant. And the piece that was significant that I hadn't understood to that point was the idea of teaching inductively, which is moving away from, here's the central idea, let's unpack it together and then spend our unit proving that that is true, to an approach where we start with our guiding questions. We don't start with the conceptual understanding. We don't display the conceptual understanding on the wall. We begin by asking our factual questions and our conceptual questions. Then we'll explore case studies, and then we move to students being able to articulate the understanding in their own words. And that was revolutionary to me, because that is where we start to believe that students are capable of doing the thinking for themselves. And if we're going to talk about student agency, to me, that's at the heart of student agency. I believe that my students are capable of seeing patterns, making connections, and building understanding. And that experience of that for them is so much more empowering and so much more memorable than being told at the beginning of the unit, this is what you need to understand. Like, talk about spoiler alert. We've already told them the understanding right at the beginning of the unit. Usually on the first day, we've put it in a newsletter to parents and said, hey, this is what we're going to understand. Versus actually, you see, I talk about this one lesson where I was actually filming my husband's teaching, and one of the students sat back in his chair and just went, mind blown. And I was sharing this with a teacher really recently, teacher called Danny, who is teaching in Australia. And she said, I can remember a very similar experience where a student just slapped their hands down on the table and went, it's that easy. Like, just when they got the understanding, and it's almost like they feel robbed of, how come I haven't understood this earlier? Like, the power and the clarity that those conceptual understandings give is so, you can visibly see the shift in students. And to me, so I guess it was the Institute that really opened my eyes to the possibility of teaching inductively and students building their own understanding. That idea had never occurred to me before that time. But It's actually seeing it in the classroom. The first time we teach it and we see students are capable of it, that's when you can never go back. I think it absolutely changed the whole way that I would approach teaching, and now I don't think I could ever do it any other way, which is exciting, to see that significant shift. I don't think anything else in my teaching to that point had made such a significant shift in the way you can visibly see students learning.
Very cool. So I get a lot of questions around central ideas, like, should we write them? Should we share them with the students? What would be your take on that? So are you saying don't bother writing central ideas, or just don't share them?
Oh, good question. I love it. No, you should absolutely write them.
Good.
And the reason you need to write central ideas is because if we're not clear on what we want our students to understand in a unit, how can we possibly hope to get them there?
Right.
So we need to be really clear as teachers, because it's from those central ideas that we design our guiding questions. So I guess I'm saying two things. Absolutely write them. You need to be very clear on what you want your students to understand in your unit, but don't share them with students. You take the central idea that you have written and design your guiding questions. And that is about teaching inductively and using that to help students construct meaning. And through those guiding questions, we're intentionally connecting to case studies, to factual examples, where we want our students to explore real events that have happened in history, or read text, or watch professional athletes to really understand something. And then they construct the understanding for themselves. So the essential idea won't match yours exactly. That's not the intent. We're not trying to develop mind readers, but we are using those planned understandings in order for students to get there. And I want to say a little bit more on that, because there's been a bit of a shift in the thinking in PYP in more recent years around getting students to plan with you.
Yes.
Which is fine, that's great. But you can't have students write the conceptual understandings with you at the beginning of the unit. And if you're
because then there's nothing to learn.
Exactly. If they can already tell you the understanding at the beginning of the unit, or if they can write a central idea before they begin their research in the exhibition, there's no point in them doing any more research. They've already understood it. So by all means, students can be involved in the process if you think that's appropriate for your students, but they should be involved in writing guiding questions, not writing central ideas, or writing lines of inquiry. A line of inquiry can be, what do I want to inquire into? What do I want to find out about? Absolutely, students can participate in that process. They can participate in choosing the case studies that they're interested in finding out more about. But if they're already writing central ideas at the beginning of the unit, then they've actually told you, we don't need to do this unit.
Right, let's find something else to study then.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I would say with all of that is we do have a curriculum with outcomes that we are committed to effectively. We have a program of inquiry, and we do know that we want students to study energy, we want them to study migration, we want them to study human body systems. So it's okay to go further and say, and this is what we'd expect them to understand. As students come up with an additional central idea or additional conceptual understanding, whatever you want to call it, that you don't have in your unit planner, fantastic. That's something to be celebrated. But we do need to spend the time articulating the understandings first.
I love that you bring up curriculum, because this has become like my soapbox, right? That curriculum isn't a dirty word. And the more that we can understand our curriculum and be flexible in how we're thinking about it, the better we serve our students and the more sustainable our program becomes. Versus it's not an open inquiry, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there can be times for open inquiry. The exhibition is designed to be a more open inquiry. But if we left everything we're doing to open inquiry or personal inquiry, then
it's
we
boring.
might have a student who has a really narrow experience of school. The thing is, and this also applies to guiding questions and letting students write the guiding questions for the unit. There is absolutely a place for student questions, but sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And we don't know enough to ask about it.
Yes.
And so being asked a really thoughtful question by an expert is so incredibly helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going through the process at the moment of building a new house. And there is so much that I don't know about construction or building a new house that I would never even think to ask about. But that doesn't mean that when I'm asked that question, I'm not invested in finding out the answer or aren't engaged in the process of the research. So I think there's a real misconception that students will only be interested and engaged in the learning if they ask the questions themselves. Some of these students are 5 and 6 years old. How would they possibly know what to ask unless we support them in that process? So it becomes a combination of both really meaningful, relevant teacher questions and student questions along the way.
My favorite example of this is I had a student, Noah, and we were doing an ancient civilizations unit, and he was like, I want to study mummies. And I was like, okay, that's a pretty fact-based, like we could study mummies, but being the expert, I introduced him to the terracotta warriors because his family was from China. And then I introduced him to the death rituals in Madagascar because that's where we were living at the time. And so his question evolved from what are mummies to what did ancient civilizations believe about life after death? What a richer question. And he wouldn't have known to ask that without having an expert in the room, seeing that larger conceptual connection and kind of nudging it.
And I bet that he was more than engaged in the study that you were doing. And so you'd captured this interest in this kind of, life after death piece that he was clearly fascinated with, but given him something that was more tangible to study and something that he could actually really dig his teeth into.
A lifelong inquiry, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Be interesting to see where he ends up in adulthood and whether it, somehow relates to.
How cool would that be? Like, Noah's like an explorer of ancient civilizations. My heart would be so happy.
Oh, indeed.
So you brought up another big aha for me from your book, which was the concept of case studies. And before reading your book, I never thought about factual information this way. It's reshaped how I think about it. So what are case studies? How do we use them?
Mm-hmm. So really, to understand the purpose of case studies, it goes right back to understanding the structure of knowledge and structure of process that Dr. Erickson developed. And so understanding that is really exploring how facts and topics provide the foundation for understanding concepts. And that's at the heart of why case studies are important. So a case study is really simply an example of the concepts or the conceptual understanding that we want to explore in order for students to start to be able to see its relevance. And we need to explore multiple case studies in order to form a generalization. I mean, if we just think about the word generalization, we are generalizing, and you can't generalize from a single example. So we explore these examples. Now, what does that look like? It's sometimes easiest to think about it in terms of something like social studies. So in your ancient civilizations example, there are multiple case studies of different ancient civilizations, and we can start to see patterns across those, which is why it's important to explore an ancient civilizations unit and give students an opportunity to explore different civilizations, just as you were describing, and not just explore one in 1 year, another ancient civilization the next year, another ancient civilization the next year, which is sometimes what we see in our curriculum. They spend sort of 5 years studying different ancient civilizations. We can also do the same thing with migrants. So studying an individual migrant or a group of migrants to help us build to an understanding of what motivates people to migrate, what challenges do migrants face when they move to a new place, what do migrants bring in terms of richness and diversity to a new community. In order to understand that, we need to see specific examples. The one that I get asked most about is, but what are case studies in mathematics? And it is a little bit more kind of challenging to think about it, but I think about it just every individual example or problem that we're solving that helps us to see the bigger picture. And we're used to using lots of examples in mathematics, we solve lots of different problems, but we go beyond in a concept-based inquiry mathematics classroom. We're not just doing lots of examples or problems in order to practice, which is what we had when I went to school. Like it would be literally 5 pages of variations of the same thing so we could practice it enough times to remember it. The examples are there to help us to really deeply understand it. So the questions that we're asking are really why is it like that? So if we were looking at a concept like fractions, we explore different examples of that. So we'll explore what is it like with a half and 3/4 and 1/16. And so that's our case studies. We need to make sure that we've explored rich case studies. That said, if we're thinking about something like literature and we're reading a novel, the case studies could be different parts of the same book. So we might be looking at an understanding around dialogue. And so the dialogue could be, the 8 pieces of dialogue within one chapter might be our case studies in that instance. It doesn't mean we need to read 7 novels in order to be able to form a generalization.
That makes so much sense. And it's such a clear way to think about it, right? So if I want students to understand that communication evolved differently across time and place, but there's continuity and change in communication.
Mm-hmm.
I can look at cuneiform. I can look at hieroglyphics. I can look at the evolution of papyrus. Those are all the case studies that build to an understanding of communication. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, absolutely. But here's what really, to me, highlights the importance of it. Because every now and then we will have teachers get so passionate about concepts and conceptual understandings that they will choose a topic that is a concept. So they'll say, this is our unit about change, or this is our unit. Actually, I can give you a good example of it with a group of teachers who studied migration. And so this is our unit on migration, but their case studies were, for this unit, for our summative assessment, we're going to have each student build an island, and then we're going to talk about what it would be like to migrate from one island to another. So students spent literally probably 3 or 4 weeks building this model of an island. And they were literally models that they, carried into school. And they were doing a little bit of mapping skills, but mostly it was this idea of migration. And then they had to talk about what would it be like to migrate from Candyland to Sports Island. And, what challenges would you face? But because there was nothing real about it, students couldn't understand that economic situations motivate people to migrate. They couldn't understand that, war and crisis and natural disasters might motivate people to migrate. They couldn't understand the personal relationships. They were just going, what would it be like if someone who ate a lot of candy moved to sports land? And yeah, we might start to understand that it can be challenging to migrate, but it's not going to get the same depth of understanding that you explore when you study real case studies and explore the real motivations, the real challenges that migrants face.
And students are so engaged by the factual examples. I think there's a misconception that, well, if they're not playing and building an island, then they're not going to be engaged. But I had 5th graders digging into the research methodology of Stonehenge and how that adapted over time. And and the concept that historians learn about the past by exploring evidence. Right? It's just, you can get so much deeper when you use these interesting and intriguing things in life, because the world's a wacky place and there are some very cool factual examples.
Absolutely. And that's when students will come home from school and be like, Mom, Dad, you'll never believe what I learned today. And they want to share their learning when they feel like they've actually learned real things. For a while, the word topic had a very kind of, a very negative connotation. And I had been in workshops before where teachers were like, I can't do topics. I've been taught that topics are bad. You can't. And I was like, okay, if topic is such a bad word for you, just think about it as, the examples or the case studies that you'll be exploring, but it is a topic. We need to have content to frame our learning. And sometimes that content gets too broad in the name of concepts as well. If we're studying human migration, we don't need to study animals migrating at the same time. That's massive. They're 2 completely different things. And so it's okay to lock it into there's a lot to understudy if we think about all human migration.
Right. Well, and that's how we develop that passion and interest in knowledge, is by going
Mm-hmm.
deeper, as opposed to going a mile wide and going, "What'd you get?" Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
So
So how do you suggest then for teachers, if I'm looking to select case studies for my unit, where do I even start?
Mm. So I think that's an amazing question and there's so many levels to be thinking about. So one is the age of our students
Mm,
and realistically how they can access information. So it will be different for a group of students who are not yet able to read, where we then need to really think a lot more creatively about our case studies, because we need to be thinking about options for interviews, options for field trips, options for hands-on learning that happens there. Once students are a little bit older and they can read somewhat independently, then new opportunities open up. But the other thing we need to be thinking about is the cultural context and relevance of the case studies that we're exploring, particularly in an international school setting.
yes.
So giving students opportunities to explore case studies that are meaningful to them. And this can be challenging as a teacher. So I found when I first started exploring the role of case studies and really thinking about the ones that I was bringing together, most of them were Western examples. And it was because they were the case studies that I had learned at
You
school.
knew.
And I didn't have enough case studies from Asia. So I think about a unit that I taught on human rights. And I realized that all of the human rights examples were either from Africa or from America or from New Zealand, where I'm from. And, that's a whole big part of the world that I'm missing out in terms of human rights activists. And I think here, using parents as a resource can be
Yes.
really key, because I can Google who might be human rights activists in different places, but I may not choose the best or most relevant examples. And so going back to parents and saying, hey, we would really love your input. We're exploring these case studies. How might we find resources that are relevant for students? How might we find, books that are written in other languages? Because here's where translanguaging also comes in, and opportunities for students to read both in the language of instruction and in any other additional languages that they might speak at home. So that's really important. And Carla Marshall, co-author of Concept-Based Inquiry in Action, talks a lot about this idea of no catastrophes before fourth grade, which I love. And thinking about can we find case studies, especially for younger children, that help them to develop a passion and a deep care for the environment and for Earth, but without freaking them out, basically, without
breaking their hearts.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it is, climate change is absolutely overwhelming, but we don't need to. I was giving feedback to someone recently in a unit that was for first grade, and it had, to know and understand climate change. And I was like, they don't need to understand all of that at 5, but they need to care about the environment. They need to, know to reduce, reuse, recycle, to plant trees, to love nature. And then, that can come in time. So that's really important when we're looking at case studies, is to make sure that we're not laying too much on these young children. And I think back to my own education, and I think back to and I compare that to what I see in a really rigorous program of inquiry. And I do think that we're doing so much better in introducing meaningful content to students, but sometimes we put a lot on early. And the other thing that I get to see from the wonderful opportunities I have to coach with teachers now is quite often we're teaching the same thing in middle school and primary school. And I think there needs to be a lot more discussion about how far we go in primary school and where we pick up from in middle school. And I think that's an issue that goes both ways. I think quite often middle school teachers treat it like students have never explored this before. But at the same time, primary school teachers feel like if they haven't taught it all by the end of 5th grade, that's it. That's their last opportunity to learn. So I think there are a lot more conversations to be had with across curriculum, and actually deeply saying, how far should we be taking this in 3rd grade, in 5th grade? Where do we pick up from in 6th grade and in 9th grade? And that's the beauty of concepts and a well-articulated conceptual curriculum.
Right.
We recommend not just having one central idea, but having 5 to 9 understandings in a unit. And when you do that, you can actually very easily say, hey, you know what, at our school we teach ancient civilizations is a good example. We teach ancient civilizations in 3rd grade, but we also teach it in middle school. Let's pull out both units and just look at the understandings. You don't even need to look at anything else. Just look at the understandings and go, are these 2 units that make sense to one builds on the other? That we get more complexity, more specificity as we go up through the grade levels? Or are we repeating the same unit twice?
I think you're going to blow people's mind there when you just said not just 1, but 5 to 9 generalizations. Can you give just an example? So ancient civilization seems to be where we're at during this chat. So what would be an example of even 3 generalizations that you would explore in that kind of a unit?
Sure. So if we were to explore a unit on ancient civilizations, we might want our students to understand something about the rules and laws that are developed within a society. So it might be an idea that, depending on the grade level students are working at, that societies, or probably societies, because we'd want it to be timeless, build rules and laws to help maintain order and keep people safe. Now, we've explored that in terms of an ancient civilization, and we've transferred that to say this is still an idea that is true today. But we might also want our students to understand something about belief systems, maybe. So we would have another idea about belief systems. We might also want them to understand something different about transportation systems that come from a society. We might want them to understand, just as you're saying before, ideas about life and death, and that might have its own understanding. So each of these concepts, instead of having to pack everything into one overarching understanding that we use for 6 weeks, each of them build into smaller generalizations where we can articulate, what do we understand about transportation systems? What do we understand about systems of governance and leadership? What do we understand about rules and laws? And in doing that, there's 2 things that are happening. One is we can get into much more, they're actually much easier for students to come to. Because when we have this broad, overarching, lofty understanding that covers everything we're learning in 6 weeks, it becomes so broad that it can become a little bit meaningless, or just doesn't give us the depth and rigor. So we get so much more depth, so much more kind of understanding from, this is what I can take from this unit and this is how it transfers to life today. Yes. The other thing is that if we're studying for 6 to 8 weeks, to have just one understanding and to say, there's only one thing I want my students to understand in the next 8 weeks, just sounds a little bit ridiculous. Right? Like, of course we're capable of more than one understanding if we're going to spend 8 weeks studying something. So we recommend 5 to 9. That said, I was working with a couple of PE and music teachers recently, and they only saw their students once a week. So if you've got one session a week in 6 weeks, you might only have 2 or 3 understandings in that time. Right. So it does relate to how much time you're spending with students in that whatever time span your unit lasts.
Would you say 5 to 9 understandings for each collaborating discipline, or 5 to 9 overall?
Great question. So what we usually start with is 5 to 9 overall when we start planning a unit. But what we would be aiming for, and I think of this as a 3 to 5 year journey, maybe more, is having 5 to 9 understandings for each discipline, if that's the focus of the unit. If, for example, you've got a unit on healthy lifestyles, and the physical education teacher is really focusing on the exercise component of it, they might just have one understanding that they're building because they're actually doing an athletics unit at the same time. Right. So they'd be building one supporting understanding, and then their other understandings would be about athletics. So we need to be mindful of that. And if we're studying mathematics, and we're making a really meaningful connection between the mathematics that we're learning, perhaps we're doing statistics and probability, and there's an understanding around the way that information is represented or presented, then that understanding might connect to our unit on migration and the movement of people across time and place. But not all of the understandings in our statistics and probability unit would. We might have some understandings about probability that don't relate to migration, and that's okay. So it's about being able to map how do these understandings go together. It's not about having 5 to 9 maths understandings that all connect to migration at the same time.
Well, and just a theme I'm picking up from you is that we don't need to be afraid of our disciplines. I think so many times, especially in PYP schools, the disciplines get watered down in the attempt to make them all fit into one theme. And I would so much rather a team say, oh yeah, in math, we totally are going to look at time here, but that's not going to take us the whole 6 weeks. So we'll spend 2 weeks and focus on 2 or 3 understandings connected to time, and then we'll move on. You know, like we don't need to beat a dead horse just because we've said that we're collaborating.
Absolutely. And so I mentioned to you before we started recording that one of the things I'm really interested in at the moment is this idea of disciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary curriculum.
Yes.
And I've been working with Rasha Al-Hagan and Nancy Fairburn on building out more of a course to articulate some of the differences between these and when and why we would choose each approach.
Cool.
And to me, the biggest thing here is about intent. So does this content fit, and does it make sense to teach it together? And let's move away from, I hope we're moving away from this idea of we are transdisciplinary, therefore
it has to fit.
You know, every possible thing that can fit should fit.
Right.
And I think that's a dangerous approach to be taking. And like you say, that's where we end up watering down curriculum. It often means that our specialist teachers, our arts and our physical education teachers, get pushed to do things that are not meaningful for their subject. And they're the ones that have the least amount of time in the first place. Right. If anybody's manipulating their curriculum to fit, it should be going the other way around, really, because our core, you know, arts teachers, we already don't give them enough time. And then we expect them to use what valuable time they have got making connections to units on explorers or ancient civilizations when actually they really want to teach about, you know,
line and shape and pattern.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And, you know, to be building out understandings that are meaningful to art. So I think first we need to be asking ourselves, is there a meaningful connection? Does this topic lend itself to a connection with literacy? So, you know, a beautiful example of that is units on exploration, migration, ancient civilizations. Of course, there's reading and there's writing involved. But if we're doing a unit on the states of matter, we might want to be doing most of that through hands-on experiments rather than just reading about it. Okay, of course, there'll be some reading, there'll be some videos, but the heart of the unit will actually be hands-on experimentation. Maybe that's the time to teach them to write lab reports or to teach them to, you know, write procedural writing. Great. But if you've already done that, it doesn't matter. You can teach them poetry at that time and it not be connected, and do meaningful concept-based inquiry learning around poetry or around personal narrative, and then do your meaningful concept-based inquiry around states of matter. So my biggest plea to teachers around this is do what makes sense and do it with intent. And there is huge value in disciplinary learning. There's huge value in interdisciplinary learning. And in actual fact, a little bit like the way we think about structured guided open inquiry, I actually think that truly transdisciplinary learning actually doesn't come about that often, because we have to have all of the knowledge and skills already in place to be able to transcend the disciplines and draw all of our understandings from that topic. More often, we're using an interdisciplinary approach in the PYP and intentionally drawing on each discipline, building conceptual understandings that support each discipline, and then integrating that in a meaningful way. And sometimes And actually, often we also use a disciplinary approach because that's what makes sense for the content that we need to teach. It's rare that topics like geometry would have a good fit to our program of inquiry in every year. There'll be maybe 1 or 2 units in the whole program of inquiry that really fit well with geometry. There's often a unit around homes and buildings that might fit well with some aspects of geometry, but let's not try and put all of our shape and space or geometry units into our program of inquiry because it doesn't fit and it doesn't need to.
Yes. If it doesn't fit, don't force it.
Absolutely.
And I think especially new PYP schools tend to get stuck on this because they get stuck in the shoulds, like, oh, I should. And my newest thing to say to schools is that I think they intentionally put agency at the center of the framework, not just for students, but for us. There are no shoulds anymore. We have agency over how we teach and what we teach and how we think our students will learn best. So just let all that go and do what you know needs to happen in your classroom.
And don't get me wrong, like integrated learning is incredibly powerful because I've also worked with schools who are not integrating curriculum and their biggest struggle is time.
Right.
Like they are running out of time for every single subject because they're not integrating anything and they're having to kind of go, well, we've only got 2 hours of science a week. And I'm like, what about what's happening in your literacy time? Let's use some of that. How does this connect? So integrated learning is powerful and we should be, using that lever in our classrooms to really get depth in our learning. But like you say, I love that about agency. Let that be at the heart of how we're making decisions and student learning ultimately. Like, will this be best for student learning? So I like to use curriculum calendars for that right at the beginning of the year, moving away from that kind of speed dating thing we used to do. And I was a PYP coordinator for many years and I planned those meetings and had my specialist teach, but it's a journey. Okay. So if you're at that point in your journey and you are having staff meetings where the music teacher has to sit with every grade level and figure out the integration, that's okay. I was there too. But really ask yourself, sit down with your music teacher or with your art teacher and ask them, are you finding this meaningful? Is this helping you to design curriculum? If it is, great. Don't mess with something that's working. But if it's not, then start to explore different opportunities for that. And as I was saying, using your curriculum calendar at the beginning of the year to say, where do units naturally integrate? There are some how we express ourselves units that you would not want to teach without the integration of your specialist arts and music teachers, because they are very much, arts is at the heart of the unit. And so to do that without the support of specialist teachers would be a real shame. But there are others that don't make sense or that don't fit.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I'd like to pivot a bit. We've talked a lot about knowledge and understanding, which makes sense, but you also get into skills and dispositions in your book. So thinking about skills, you talk about the difference between acquiring skills and acquiring processes. That wasn't something that I'd really heard before, but it really helped me in my practice. So what do you mean by acquiring processes? And can you give some examples?
Sure. So this really draws from the work of Dr. Lois Lanning, who, it's funny, actually. I'll give you a little bit of a backstory and then I'll dive into the explanation and the question you've asked. So Dr. Lois Lanning met Dr. Erickson at one of her very early presentations of her work on concept-based curriculum. And she said that it was the first time she'd ever kind of waited around and then gone up the front to speak to the presenter. And she said it just absolutely resonated with her. And they formed a really tight friendship and connection. And Lois was working in a school district helping them design curriculum at that time. And so she was giving a lot of feedback to Lynn Erickson over the years of the development of Lynn's work, and as Lynn was presenting, supporting her with a lot of examples. But when it came to writing the English language arts curriculum, Lois was very excited because this was her area of passion. She'd done her PhD around literacy, and she was excited to get into writing the curriculum. And she suddenly went, wait, this doesn't quite work. Concept-based, the way that we're teaching it doesn't quite work in literacy. And Lynn, she went directly to Lynn and went, it's not working right. And she said, oh yeah, of course it does. Go back and try it. And it wasn't until Lois articulated the structure of process that piece fell into place. And basically the idea around the structure of process is that we can articulate understandings about processes, strategies, and skills, as well as understandings that are drawn from facts and from knowledge. And up until that point, all of the understandings in English had been about the themes of the text. So the bigger kind of content pieces that we could get out of what we were reading. But Lois's work really helped us to understand that we could draw an understanding about a process, which is quite macro, like the process of comprehension. Or we could draw an understanding about a strategy, like perhaps inference. Or we could draw an understanding about something quite micro, like a skill, and that might be text-to-text connection. So there are these different levels, which is why if you look at the structure of processes, strategies, and skills are all put in the same box. Because you can articulate an understanding about a process, or about a strategy, or about a skill. But in the structure of knowledge, you would never generalize about one single fact.
Right. Okay.
But skills, even though they're very, very specific, sometimes quite micro, we still need to draw an understanding about that particular skill. And again, here comes the 5 to 9 understandings. In order to really comprehend, we need to be able to understand lots of different skills. So that the process is the most macro of those, and it's about understanding what is to be done. And then the skills is very micro, so the specific operations that we will work through in order to achieve that strategy or that process.
Might I clarify with an example?
Yeah, please.
And I'm curious if you would say, so would like design thinking be a process that we could generalize? And then the concrete skills within that would be things like empathizing, ideating are the concrete skills.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there other kind of...
We could form generalizations about either.
Cool. Other processes that are common that kind of help click this light on for people?
So think about the process as being really macro. So if we were thinking about it in terms of the arts, some of the processes would be the different types of art that we explore. So there would be a drawing process, a sculpting process, quite macro. In order to do any of those things, you would need to have a lot of skills to be able to be successful in that process. If we thought about it in terms of something like physical education, often when we work with PE teachers, all of their understandings are about really quite macro ideas around fitness. But if you're going to play a sport successfully, we need to get right down into strategies and skills. So thinking about concepts like offense and defense, and then particularly going more micro than that into things like intercepting the ball. So we can work on the kind of that really quite macro level of team skills and communication, but we can also go right down to a skill like intercepting the ball and write an understanding about that. So the way that I like to think about it is think about it in terms of more macro would be your processes, and then much more micro. What are the skills that we need to be able to do in order to be successful in that process?
One question I always like to ask myself when planning for processes is, what do experts at this do? Is there a framework that they're using? Is there a system that experts use that I could introduce to my students? And that for me was a big, it helps.
The other thing that I like to think about in terms of physical education that really helps for PE teachers is imagine that you're the coach on the side of the pitch. And when your players come off, what are the strategies that you're talking about? What are the plays that you're talking about? What are the concepts that you would be exploring in your role as a coach? And
Cool.
that really helps them to get down and away from this really big overarching, athletes set goals and the athletes, do things for fitness. And if we want our students to improve, we actually, in something like physical education or music or any skill-based discipline, there's lots of quite micro things that they need to understand that a professional athlete, like you say, understands, but they haven't yet understood. I think about it when I was, this is a stupid thing to admit, but when I was at, I think kind of middle school, we were playing football. I didn't even understand the offside rule because I hadn't grown up. I didn't come from a family where we watched a lot of sport. So nobody had explained to me at all this idea of offside. And I was running around. I was actually doing really well because I was offside half the time. But there's understandings in terms of the rules of the game that students need in order to be able to play effectively as well. And so we had gone from, all through primary school, we were really just developing skills to suddenly playing these games, which I didn't even have an understanding. And they were like, offside. And I was like, what's offside? I don't know what offside is. And they'd shout it at me and I'd be like, oh. And then I'd be offside a minute later because I hadn't understood this, quite fundamental part of the way that football was played. I had watched a lot of netball and I had played netball. And so I had learned in netball that there were parts of the court that I could be on and couldn't be on, but I hadn't transferred that over to football. So there's a lot for young people to understand in order to grow and be successful.
Yes. Well, and I think that concept of coach is so transferable. Like if I were a historian at a work site, what would be the advice from my coach in that setting? If I were an artist working on a sculpture, what would my coach say? So I think that's a very cool hat to put on in your planning process is if I were at the sides, what would be that coaching advice? That's cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other piece,
also, and going back to that piece that I mentioned earlier, when we're writing our curriculum and the students aren't there with us in the room, we always need to be challenging ourselves. Is this new learning? Because so often it's not. So often, I've seen middle school teachers write understandings and I'll say, that's a fantastically worded understanding, but it's one that I have taught myself in third grade. And so how are we making sure that these understandings are actually the new learning that's happening for our students?
Well, and getting deeper, because it might be the same understanding, but there is depth to it because you're adding on, a new perspective or a new case study that unlocks something, but to be able to justify that depth.
Yeah, many years ago when the PYP first started releasing some examples of disciplinary unit planners, they released an example of some maths planners. There was a shift where teachers started to say, well, we're just going to articulate the understanding for all, it's the same central idea for all grade levels in math, because of course we spiral, we teach statistics every year. So here's the understanding for statistics, for maths that we work to in every year. The problem with that is if our students have already truly understood it in kindergarten, why are we still teaching it every year? So the language specifically that Lynn Erickson used around this was we need to be increasing the complexity and specificity of our concepts. Cool. And to me, that really resonates because you're right. We sometimes are revisiting. We teach statistics and probability every year from kindergarten to 12th grade. Just like I was saying earlier, we teach character every year from kindergarten to grade 12. So what's the new learning? What's the new understanding? And that will be reflected in the complexity and specificity of the concepts. It doesn't mean that we teach character once and it's done. But if we're going to revisit it, what's the new learning here?
That's cool. Yeah, what door is this unlocking? I like that. The other piece then is dispositions, because you can't talk about skills without dispositions. And one thing I loved from your book is you talk about open-mindedness, but you also contrast that with evidence-mindedness. And that one, I loved that. So can you talk about those mindsets?
Yeah, absolutely. So looking at the idea of open-mindedness and evidence-mindedness is really at the heart of what do our students need to be able to be successful in building the skills as an inquirer. And so we've talked a lot about case studies, and in a concept-based classroom, we ask students when they form their understandings or when they articulate the generalization or central idea for themselves in their own language, we immediately go back to, so what evidence do you have? What examples can you give to prove that that is true? And so we're using evidence to build understanding, and then we're using evidence again to prove that the understanding is true. Or sometimes we're using evidence to prove that the understanding is not true and that we still need to refine our understanding, which is also incredibly powerful. And we can use that language of what evidence do you have with our students to support them with that, to really articulate that. And the other one that we talk about is persistence-mindedness.
Yeah.
And so to be building, this is the idea of celebrating failure, and that we don't always get the right answer the first time, that sometimes we need to try and try again, that sometimes we will, read a book and it won't have the answer that we're looking for. So it's building up that resilience in students to know that some of their struggle is a part of the learning, and it doesn't, failure doesn't mean that you're not good at something. Failure means that you need to try again, or that you didn't quite get it this time, and almost starting to expect that. There's a beautiful, I'm just trying to remember the name, Jeff Utek once attended one of his workshops, and he shared this beautiful video of a student who was making a Rube Goldberg machine, or a child who was making it. It was in a home situation. And a Rube Goldberg machine, for those who aren't familiar, is basically where one reaction creates another reaction. So the ball rolls down the ramp and it hits something, and then something else happens. And so it's a chain of events, basically, to create a small, usually it's a small task at the end. So in this case, I think it was capturing the monster with a little net that dropped at the end, or a little basket that dropped at the end. But the lovely part of it was that this young boy, he was probably about 8, had this little whiteboard, I still remember it, where he had drawn with tally marks how many times he expected it to fail before it succeeded. And that's, to me, at that heart of persistence-mindedness of, I know that it might not go the way I want it to go, but I know what my ultimate goal is. Cool. And so building up that resilience and that persistence in students so that they can, ride out life's challenges, and so that they aren't, that, in a world of that instant gratification, that they can still pursue something when it does become challenging. And then in terms of open-mindedness is one that we are more familiar with, using it within the PYP and helping our students to step back and see different perspectives, that developing that culturally responsive classroom where we are exploring different case studies helps us to build that open-mindedness. I also think building a concept-based classroom where we are building understandings about the experience of others and about human motivation helps us to become more open-minded as well. So, yeah, I think being mindful of that and actually writing conceptual understandings, that's another piece of why it's powerful to have 5 to 9 understandings. When we're developing our program of inquiry unit that might have a social studies or a science focus, we can actually write an understanding about one of the approaches to learning, or we can write an understanding about a learner profile attribute like open-mindedness.
Yes.
So we might have 5 understandings that are about the knowledge of the unit that we're focusing on, whether that's ecosystems or human body systems, but we might also have an understanding about what it means to be a communicator. And here again, this is something that we have those approaches to learning from when they're 5 to when they're grade 12. How does that look different? And one way to articulate that, I've heard lots of schools talk about, let's develop a continuum. Well, let's develop conceptual understandings that actually live in our unit, that we are teaching to, that we are asking questions and having students articulate it. Because the risk with just building a continuum is it will only ever exist on paper. How is it actually transforming our teaching? When we take it to the level of this is an understanding that we want our students to articulate for themselves, what makes an effective communicator, and maybe looking at some micro concepts that are associated with that. For young children, it might be concepts like active listening or eye contact or questioning that come with that. Putting those into a generalization and saying, what makes an effective question, or how do people show they're listening, and actually asking students those questions to build to understanding as well.
I love that because it's so easy, like you said, to select an ATL, select a learner profile, and it sits at the top of your unit planner. It sits on your inquiry board, and once in a while you point at it and you go, yeah. But if it's not embedded in those understandings, we are a constructivist program where our goal is understanding. So if you're not thinking to yourself, how will they understand and apply this? Then it's not going to happen. It is just going to sit on the side.
It'll make some pretty posters in the hallway or on your wall, but it's not really actually changing the way that you're teaching. And so that's why I like to encourage teachers to really intentionally put in an understanding about, it doesn't have to be all of them, but which of the approaches to learning are you really focused on in this unit in a meaningful way? Which of the learner profile attributes are we really working to develop in this unit? And what do you want your students to understand about that? Again, that will be new learning.
Yes. So cool. This is kind of a pivot a little bit, but you talked about it earlier. I get asked a lot about how we get kids to ask deeper questions, because at the end of the day, it's concept-based, but it's inquiry. So if students don't have a question, then it's not an inquiry. If students aren't excited to learn, it's not an inquiry. So how do we get them to actually ask questions they care about?
First, I want to go back to what you said. If students don't have a question to ask, it's not inquiry, because I don't necessarily agree with that one.
Okay.
I think if the teacher can ask a really good question, it can be inquiry. And that's what I was saying about earlier with an expert. Like if an expert asks a good question, I might not have another question to ask. My inquiry might be answering somebody else's
question.
Yeah.
Okay. So students don't have to form their own questions, but they need to have curiosity about a question.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do want them forming questions. And so I wholeheartedly believe that students should be asking questions as part of an inquiry. I just want to kind of specify that either can prompt.
Right. Release that. I think question banks are a great tool, and we should be using them more for sure.
Absolutely. So when it comes to students writing questions, the biggest thing that I find in classrooms and why we're forcing it so much is we ask them for questions too early.
Yes.
We're asking them for questions right up in the engage phase when students actually don't have a question yet. They really don't know enough to ask a genuine question. The other thing that I think is really important that I've come to understand over time is sometimes student questions don't take the form of a question. They won't start with what, where, how, or why. They'll start with a statement that is really kind of a test of like, this is what I believe to be true. What do you think is almost what they're saying. They'll put out something that they're not sure about, and they'll want some clarification on that. And as teachers, we need to really listen for those kind of statements where it's really like a wondering more than a well-articulated question. And we need to kind of be able to recognize that, hear that, and say, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. How would we find out if that was true or not? And then really help our students to frame a question from that. So there's a difference between getting good questions when we invite students to write questions and actually being able to listen for and hear genuine acts of inquiry. And they will come very naturally once students are engaged. You almost don't have to teach them to ask questions. Humans are inquisitive beings, just by our very nature. Students will start asking questions when they start wondering. And so it takes some rich opportunities for engagement, some shared learning experiences, and then the questions will start to flow from there.
Yes. I was lucky Tanya Latanzio came to our school, and one of the biggest ahas I took away from her session was just provoke, and provoke early. So like I started putting out a provocation table 2 weeks before our unit even started.
Mhm.
And then I would just creep around the edges, like I'd add a new object and then I'd kind of listen to the kids talking. And they mentioned Greek goddesses. The next day there's a poster of Greek goddesses in the private. That just having this culture of there's a space where kids can gather and chat and you can learn more about what really is stoking the fire of curiosity there.
Mhm. The other thing that I love to do right at the beginning of the unit is a strategy that Carla introduced me to, and it's the four-corner debate. And I use four-corner debates all the time
Oh, they
now.
love it.
And the debate is really just taking a question and making it a statement. And it's a teacher question, but making it a statement and then having them take a stance on that. And from that, you hear so much, and often you'll hear their questions come out in the four-corner debate. Like I was doing it with a group of adults at a workshop a couple of weeks ago, and we were doing around migration, and they were like, but wait, what is a migrant even? And so, just those questions that were coming up, and like, well, would we consider that a citizen, or are they a migrant? Can a migrant also be a citizen? And just these rich questions that were coming up from the four-corner debate. And that's where you want to be like scribing like crazy to capture the genuine questions, because that is what they actually want to know.
Right.
So yeah, I couldn't agree more that the questions will come when we have really provoked their thinking, when we've engaged their minds, when we've given them some real content to wrestle with, and some real case studies to start to explore. That's when our questions will flow.
You have so many cool strategies in your book that I've just stolen over the years. So anybody's
well,
looking,
don't consider it stealing. That's what we want.
It's just everything that you have, the concept sorts and just all these different tools that it's wild to use them in your classroom. So I can't say highly enough about your book. If anybody's listening, get this book, try it out. Like, I'm not getting paid to say this, but it's transformative to just do the inquiry in the way that you describe and see everything that happens. And it changes you.
What I would say about our book, I don't think I've got a copy sitting right here, but it is quite a thick book. And I don't want people to get overwhelmed by that, because if they pick it up and they only get through the first chapter, the first 3 chapters are kind of laying the foundation.
Right.
But once you get through the first 3 chapters, there is a chapter on each of the phases of inquiry, and it's packed with strategies. We intended it to be the book that you would have on your lap when you were planning. And actually, we had a bit of a back and forth with the publisher, because they wanted to publish it in a smaller format. And we were like, no, it needs to be bigger. It needs to be something that you can lay open on your lap and just be able to go, hey, we haven't tried this dimension strategy. Let's give that a go and see if that works as we're building out our understanding of this concept. Or we do a four-corner debate in every unit. Let's try something different. What else could we do to engage the students?
It's not a book you read once. It's always like, your Kindle has like your top 6 books or whatever. Your book is always in my top 6 books. So
well, it's also, it can be a book that you don't necessarily ever read from cover to cover. It can be a book that you just dive into and that you read kind of the top section of it. And then you don't have to read every single strategy in your first read. You can go, oh yeah, I understand the purpose of it, read the first 3 chapters, and then just dive into the strategies throughout and kind of read new ones each time you open it.
It's such a good book. So I'm just wondering, do you have advice for teachers who are just starting out with your book or just with planning inquiries? What are the kind of the aha moments that, like, I think you just need to do inquiry, right? So like, how do you get started?
Great question. So when I'm talking with school leaders about possible workshops that we're doing, quite often I will say there are 2 paths here. You can start as a school in really delving into what are your conceptual understandings. So let's start there and let's get our unit solid with the conceptual understandings. We'll have the 5 to 9 understandings, we'll have the guiding questions, and then we can move into another workshop around strategies. Okay. Or sometimes schools are like, no, actually, we're just at the inquiry phase. We've got our central idea, but we want teachers to understand inquiry. And then we'll start with that. We'll start with, okay, so let's just start exploring strategies. Even if we haven't got all of our 5 to 9 understandings written yet, let's just start with, hey, we could try a four-corner debate tomorrow.
Let's play.
Or yeah, we could do an is not. and explore what they understand about that concept. And then when students and teachers start to get familiar and confident with those strategies, they'll naturally be starting to build to understandings. And then that's when teachers will need to spend some more time really understanding how to craft strong conceptual understandings. And so I've done workshops both
Chicken and
ways.
the egg.
Yeah, absolutely.
Love it. I've got one kind of last pretty big question for you, and it's the question I get all the time as well, is when we're planning inquiry, how much should we plan in advance versus how responsive should we be?
I love this question. I do genuinely think that we need to plan in advance what we want our students to understand, know, and be able to do as a result of this unit. We have a curriculum that we are accountable for. There are particular, if we're following a national or state curriculum, then there's content in that. If we're designing our own scope and sequence, as many schools do, then really it's at that curriculum level and the level of scope and sequence where we need to be able to start with understandings, knowledge, and skills. That bit to me is the non-negotiable. You can't start wading into a unit and 3 weeks into the unit be going, what do we think we might get to as an understanding in this unit? Oh, well, the students are kind of interested. You will find yourself spinning your wheels and you won't get depth of understanding. I've seen those classrooms happening, and you kind of get to the end of the unit and go, well, we sort of got halfway through what we thought we might do, and then we did this other thing, but actually next time we'd probably do it differently. I do genuinely believe that there is a place for personal inquiry in the curriculum, but I don't believe all inquiry should be personal inquiry. And I think if we're going to use a more structured or guided approach, we need to be articulating the understandings before we start the unit. And you know what? Once we've articulated the understandings, we can design our guiding questions. And from those guiding questions, we can start to build out learning engagements. Of course, we're going to be responsive to student interest.
Right.
But much of that response to student interest comes in the case studies that we explore. So giving students choice where it makes sense. But even there, I've just come back from a trip to Australia where I was working with 2 different schools in Australia, and the Australian curriculums that they're working with have specific content related to Australian social studies, effectively, that they have to cover. If they're going to study exploration, they have to study that in the context, firstly, of Australia, and then they can start to study other explorers around the world. So there are also sometimes case studies, whatever our home country is, or whatever our, wherever we're teaching, there is a responsibility to teach some content relating to that place and not letting it always be choice.
Right.
And so being able to kind of go back and forth between student choice and teacher's choice of case study. And the other thing I would say with that is we do need to be a little bit careful when we give students choice, not to make it, you can choose any migrant that you like, or you can choose any explorer that you want, because we need to be setting them up for success. If they choose a case study that they literally can't find enough information on, that's not fair to them either. It might be something that they're interested in, but if it doesn't have age-appropriate resources, or the only place they can find information is on the internet, then we're not really setting the students up for success in building the research skills that we want to support them with. So I would much prefer, and I've seen lots of schools do this really successfully, where say there's 3 teachers in a grade level. Each teacher sets up a bank of 3 or 4 different case studies that students can choose from. Now they've got, 9 to 12 case studies that they can explore, and they can choose from that set of 12. But when they choose from that set of 12, they know that there's a bank of curated websites where they will find relevant information. There's some really interesting videos to watch. There's some good age-appropriate books that the librarian has purchased in advance, ideally even in multiple languages where they can access it. And then there's maybe someone in the local community that they can also interview, or a field trip that they can do, so that they're also building their skills as a researcher, and they're learning to use different resources. that teachers can pull the 4 or 5 students who've chosen that case study together and teach them note-taking because they're reading the same book. So we just have to be careful about how much choice we give them and why. And I think weighing as a team to say, what are the benefits and challenges associated with more choice? The other thing we have to be careful of is, do the case studies, when we are giving students choice, whatever they choose, does it actually relate to the understandings that we want our students to build to? Because I've seen all too often where students will choose a case study. A good example of this is when students are studying belief systems. More than once, I've seen students choose Pastafarians, which is a belief system, but there's not much information about it, and it doesn't follow the normal kind of structure of belief systems. And if you're trying to build to set understandings, you're not going to get there with this very small. I mean, it sounds cool because we think about pasta and then we go, okay, so that's going to be really interesting. But it takes them just down a kind of very small rabbit hole where they get a little bit stuck. They can't answer their research questions, and it's not setting them up for success. So although they were interested in it on that day because it sounded cool, it doesn't give them enough for a 3-week investigation.
Well, it's like everything falls on a continuum, right? So we don't want kids to have complete choice. We don't want to have no choice at all. And I think if you're a teacher and you're just starting out with this, try 2 or 3 case studies. So we're going to look at civilizations. You can look at beauty rights, you can look at death rights, or you can look at communication and transportation over time, right? That's a lot of choice. Like there's so many paths we can go. It doesn't need to be an all or nothing.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And we do need to be thinking about to what extent each of those things is really going to create engagement for students. And that idea of agency, I said to you at the beginning that there is particularly one thing that I would change if we were to write the book again.
Yes.
And it's the diagram that we have in terms of structured, guided, and open inquiry. Because we have it on a continuum, and it's called the teaching continuum. And at one end is direct instruction, and then structured inquiry, guided inquiry, open inquiry, and then discovery learning, which we don't advocate for. Discovery learning is proven to have really poor outcomes because typically students will hold on to misconceptions. There's not enough support for them to be successful. Anyway, on the piece that I would change is on either end of that, we said, more teacher direction, less teacher direction. And then we said more student agency, less student agency. So we were saying basically the more open the inquiry is, the more student agency. The more structured it is, the less student agency. And now I just think that's wrong.
Basically, there can be agency and structure, totally.
You can have less student agency in open inquiry. How often do we see students flounder when we give them a lot of choice? Not all students. Some students will absolutely thrive. But there'll be some students who 4 weeks into the unit still haven't picked a topic or have changed their topic 4 times and haven't actually got anything to show for their 4 weeks of research. So a structured inquiry can give students really high agency. And this is where I think the PYP does a great job because they talk about it as voice, choice, and ownership. You can have less choice, but very high voice and very high ownership. And to me, when we ask students to articulate, what do you understand as a result of this learning? They own the understanding. That's where we see really high agency. So it could have been a structured inquiry where we chose the case study for them, but they own the understanding that comes from that. Also, think about a topic like mathematics. How often do we say, what do you want to study in mathematics this year? And you're not interested in statistics, never mind, we'll skip that. Like, there are pieces that we just have to teach. There are outcomes that we have to get to. And so it can't be complete choice. Yes, sometimes we can, they can choose one problem or another, or they can choose levels of problems that they want to solve, which can be really great for differentiation. But there's content that has to be covered. And so we've got to be really mindful of that and looking for ways that we can support that high ownership and that high voice.
So amazing. Yeah, it's just so many takeaways from your book. And that was one of them. It's just that, like, we have responsibility. We're facilitators. We have a curriculum. That's not a bad thing. It's a great thing. And there's flexibility, and there is inflexibility, and that's okay too. I don't know. It makes inquiry feel a lot more doable, I think.
Absolutely. Well, that's what we hope to achieve, to empower teachers, to give teachers agency in terms of understanding why they're doing what they're doing. And also, to me, one of the words that comes up over and over again is intent. Why are we doing what we're doing? And to be able to really sit down and talk about that as a team of teachers, is this the right unit? Sometimes I think I love the PYP, I love the program of inquiry, but sometimes we end up with some really wacky units just based on the transdisciplinary theme. I'm sure you're laughing because I'm sure you can relate. I'm sure you could come up with a couple of examples.
What is this
really
unit?
Weird units.
What are we studying here?
We've got to get rid of them. We've got to go. Yeah, this whole, like, some of the units that we put into our program of inquiry might be interesting for a lesson or for a week, but they don't warrant a 6-week or an 8-week inquiry. And it just ends up as, the teachers feel lost, the students feel lost, or they go, great, there's one unit where we can just put that into 2 weeks and be done with it. Because it's not, and what's the point in that, really? What's the point in going to all the effort to plan something out when it's not meaningful? So, the program of inquiry gives us really great opportunities to articulate. To me, it's an articulated learning journey of the student to say, if our students go through this school, here's the learning that they'll be exploring. And that's so important to be working through that process. But we've just got to make sure that we do have rigorous and meaningful and interesting topics in each grade level. One of the ones that I loved, one of the changes we made when I was at Frankfurt International School, was in reviewing our health at PSHE curriculum, we realized that we didn't have any of the teaching that we had all grown up with around kind of stranger danger and safety and the kind of safe touch and friendships and relationships that had all got lost in the framework of the program of inquiry. So we took a unit that was a really kind of strange unit in the how we organize ourselves strand, I think, and put in this unit around how do we organize ourselves and our community to keep ourselves and others safe. And It was such a good unit, but it really came from our review of the health curriculum and going, we're not creating enough opportunities to talk about stranger danger, to talk about, especially for students in an international setting, they tend to grow up a little bit more in a bubble. They're not necessarily walking to school by themselves the way that students in a small town and other places might be. So just getting those lessons of what do you do when you're lost? What do you do when you when somebody comes up to you and starts talking to you in a playground? All of those kinds of conversations that we realized we didn't have a place for in our curriculum, and we weren't talking about it. We were all assuming that was happening somewhere else, or that was happening at home, and so we made an intentional spot for it in curriculum.
So doing just like a gap analysis, our goal is to create these well-rounded little human beings, and here sits this 6-week unit that we all hate and we're pulling ourselves through. What would we fight to teach? That's a question I got from Kevin Bartlett, and that I just love.
That. Yes.
Right? Stranger danger. I would fight to teach that my kids know how to keep themselves safe. And that's the feeling you should go into a unit with. Like, I would fight to teach this, not like, oh gosh, 8 weeks on whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. The transdisciplinary themes were designed to create a balanced curriculum. But sometimes I think that there is a danger in always starting with what does the transdisciplinary theme start with. And I don't believe that was ever the way they were intended. I think we should also be starting from what do we believe we should be teaching in science? That's why we write a science scope and sequence. What do we believe we should be teaching in social studies? What do we believe we should be teaching in arts? And where does that fit in our curriculum? Where do we teach things like digital citizenship now? And, online gaming and the watching of YouTube, like all of that. Where does that fit in our curriculum? Absolutely. And be asking ourselves questions that way rather than just starting with the transdisciplinary theme descriptors. There's one place that we can look, but it shouldn't be the beginning and the end of how we design our program of inquiry.
What a beautiful place to pause. Well, Rachel, this has been just like an absolute pleasure for me to nerd out with you and just ask you all the questions I could ever imagine. That it's really a dream come true. So I'm just so thankful that you came on today.
Oh, I love it. It's been, such a great opportunity. Let's do it again sometime.
Yeah. When you're working on new projects, keep me posted and you'll come back on the show anytime.
Absolutely will. Awesome.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.